Hello there, John Kuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, thank you to everyone who makes it possible for me to live my vision every day, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life to help you with your goals, or as a listener or supporter of the podcast. Thank you to everyone. Today I'm going to be making a reflection on the concept of intuition in general and also in my personal and professional experience. Now, as per usual, if you have any concerns about your own life or the life of somebody else, never take what you find on the internet as advice. Please seek advice from a professional. Now, intuition has something of an interesting place in pop culture and also in spiritual practice as well. And often the term can have a variety of different meanings, different significance. But in general, intuition is an idea or insight that you obtain without actually being able to specify exactly what the source is or on what evidence you're basing that idea. It, as people say, just comes to you. It just comes to mind. In spirituality, intuition is related to, although I'm told is not exactly the same as the concepts of extrasensory perception or psychic practice. It's the ability to know of information without explicitly being told it or without obtaining it through the senses. That's why it's associated with what we call extrasensory perception, perceiving outside of the senses. And my regular listeners will know that I've been collaborating regularly with Ebony Wamaki, who is an intuitive reader, and in our first collaboration we discussed topics relating to spirituality and how spirituality compares to scientific practice, and she talked about her intuitive practice. People say to trust your intuition. People say your intuition is there for a reason. Others say it's completely nonsensical. The problem with intuition is not so much that it's bad or that it's unnecessary. In fact, I'm going to argue the opposite. It's a necessary part of life. But the flaw in it is that if we're not aware of exactly what influences it, then it's hard for us, often impossible for us, to verify exactly how accurate or how valid it is. When we experience an intuition, we can't specify the source of it, and we still don't fully understand how it works, although we could quite safely argue that often our intuition is based on information that we have received as normal, but it is stored in memory, long-term memory, outside of our conscious awareness. If that information is indeed accurate and valid, then in those cases intuition may be valid, but that's not inevitable. Usually our intuition is not based on that. The problem is that if a judgment is based only on fleeting, vague information that we have stored in our unconscious, or it's based on a feeling, it will inevitably be tainted by our own cognitive bias. That is to say, the flaws in the way that we process information that make our conclusions that we draw from it not based on objective reality. If we rely on intuition too strongly, we may find ourselves drawing a large number of conclusions based on biased information. Some people say, well, your intuition is there for a reason. I'm going to address this in just a minute, but we have to be careful when we make those judgments, because to say that something is there for a reason suggests that it serves a purpose. And while it is actually plausible to suggest that our intuition is there for a reason, and a lot of our functioning actually can be explained in terms of having a specific purpose to aid in our survival, to aid in our functioning, we have to be careful not to assume that our intuition is an infallible guide and that it should be trusted in exactly the same way to exactly the same extent when making any type of judgment. We must be careful not to take it literally or to take it on face value. Now, if you are a spiritualist who has intuitive capabilities or can practice extrasensory perception, as Ebony does, then this is certainly not the context for me to argue that it's not true or that it doesn't exist. That is a completely different type of argument, and it's a discussion that has to be had in its own right, so I'm certainly not going to argue it here. But if you are someone who doesn't have those experiences, you also have to be careful to check your intuition to ensure that it's not based on faulty information. If you have an intuition, it may be based on information that was obtained from a completely unrelated situation some time ago and then stored in long-term memory, and perhaps you're referring to it without knowing it. And it's possible for it to not necessarily be as relevant to the present decision that you're making as you may assume it is. That's why scientific practice exists. It aims to eliminate bias so that we're, as much as possible, drawing conclusions based on information that is true without reference to our own perception. But on the other side of the argument, without a sense of intuition, we couldn't survive. Or at the very least, we wouldn't be able to live life practically. Using intuition is incredibly important in situations in which you don't have the resources to undertake a systematic examination of every possible aspect of an issue before making a decision of it. In our everyday life, we have to make quick decisions and we can't investigate everything in depth. So we have to take some sorts of shortcuts. And sometimes our intuition is the only factor which can influence in any way what decisions we make. Now, as per usual, again, you have to be careful that those decisions are not going to be troublesome for you, but sometimes after you've absorbed all the information that is practicable in that situation, sometimes your intuition is the only factor on which people make decisions. To give an example, you'll know from my previous work that I obtain great satisfaction in solving everyday problems. And when I'm looking for a solution to something, be it a household product or a piece of software or something to use in my business, whatever it may be, I like to investigate my options as thoroughly as possible. But when I'm investigating something on the internet, often there is information conflicting. When I'm researching a product, for example, that I need, often there is conflicting information because obviously no product is going to be perfect and no person's perception is going to be exactly the same as somebody else's. When I choose a solution, often I have to base it on some intuition. So, for example, if I've absorbed information about a range of different possible choices and all the information on one choice seems to be consistent, either consistently favorable or consistently unfavorable, then sometimes my intuition may be based on similar experiences that I've had with similar problems that I've solved, and I may draw the conclusion that if the information is consistent, then it's more likely to be true, that the pattern doesn't seem to be loose or unreliable. There seems to be consistent reference to particular ideas or particular information in reference to this solution. I can't verify it myself unless I actually try that solution. I'm not an engineer, so I can't objectively evaluate the quality of every product that's available. Without using intuition based on what information is available to me, I simply couldn't make a decision. I take a similar approach when deciding on a solution based on how workable it's going to be into the future. That is to say, if a product is likely to be usable into the future, am I likely to be able to get spare parts? Is a particular piece of software likely to be user-friendly for me into the future, or is it going to cause me problems? Looking at the features and comparing those features to other solutions in that same domain sometimes doesn't provide me with a straightforward answer to those types of questions. But using my intuition and what I know about similar situations, I can make a guess of whether something is likely to be favorable or unfavorable to me. It's never perfect, but sometimes that's all we have. What we also need to consider is that in life in general, in nature, in objective reality, the idea that everything that exists or everything that is true must be observable through the senses, and that's one of the assumptions used in science. Remember that the actual truth of anything is that we only believe something to be true often because we have observed it in some way, because we've been able to perceive it through the senses or because we've been exposed to the idea. But an objective truth, like a self-evident truth, is that just because we can't perceive something, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Because if we extend that logic, we could also say that anything that we personally have not seen doesn't exist because other people could be lying about it. That may be a stretch in logic, but that's just the nature of reality. Phenomena can exist without us perceiving them and without us necessarily having observed them. There have been recorded cases in history, though, of people having intuitions, having insights that are extremely specific, so specific that normally to consider them to be true, we would have to investigate them systematically using a very rigorous scientific method. And people have had these insights and have tried to tell other people that they had these insights, but they couldn't cite any evidence for them, or they couldn't cite any reasoning for how they came to those conclusions. And then later, those insights were subject to rigorous scientific testing and found to be true. Anyone can make the argument that it's all a lie, it's all a story. But it's not intellectually honest to assume that just because a field, science in this case, professes to be able to be the arbiter of whether something is objectively true or objectively not true, it's intellectually dishonest to assume that that is always the truth. One of the most complicated aspects of science is that it assumes that everything is observable. we actually don't know objectively whether anything exists outside of perception, whether anything exists that can't be observed through the senses. Science is a method to reduce the likelihood of us making mistakes in perception, but just because science can't explain or conceive of something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, something to which I can personally testify, and I'm not saying that I'm the only person to have had this experience. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the world who have had similar experiences, and certainly more significant ones, is that a lot of how I developed my counseling practice actually started with intuitions that then I later discovered were actually part of scientific practice and had been tested and found to be valid. Which is not to say that I was testing experimental methods on my clients, or to say that I was simply doing as I pleased in the moment without any reference to scientific practice. I always based my approaches on scientifically validated counseling methodologies. But there have been times throughout my career in which I've sensed in moments, even though the book, so to speak, says to do this, this isn't what my client needs. It's not going to be effective to actually help them. I need to modify it slightly. And my intuition would tell me, if you take this communicative approach instead of this one, your client will find it more helpful. And I've done that, and it's been exactly what the client needs. Worst case scenario, it's been equally effective as some other types of methods that are already documented. But often they've been effective based on my intuition. Then I found later through the literature in my research that those methods were already validated, already been tested. This prompted me to acknowledge that just because something, human functioning in this case, is difficult to specify in the methodologies of science, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or it doesn't mean that it's not valid. And the problem is that if we try to categorize every aspect of every phenomenon according to rigid rules, we actually miss the complexity of the world. We miss all the richness of the detail. Remember that, again, scientific principles are invented by us in order to observe the world in as accurate and unbiased fashion as possible, but it can never be perfect. Often people who follow scientific principles in a rather dogmatic fashion, they'll make the argument, if it can't be observed through science, there's no reason to believe it. Well, to say there's no reason to believe something is incredibly short-sighted, because science only allows us to demonstrate what is observable. When science can't explain something, there is absolutely a valid reason to believe that there may be something outside of our perception that exists. And that's not to say that I believe that any specific phenomenon exists without any question. A lot of what I perceive in the world is to me an unknown because I can't objectively verify it. But I would rather not take a position on something unless I can see the evidence and there is a good reason to take a position there. On many issues I do take a position, but in many questions of life I have a reason to say I don't actually know the answer to this and I haven't seen any evidence to demonstrate what the correct answer may be. So I'll simply continue the journey looking for evidence. But there is definitely a reason to believe that sometimes a lot of our human abilities and a lot of what happens in the world exists outside of what we perceive, exists outside of what we can observe. And solving problems often requires us to use that type of complex reasoning to synthesize solutions. And we have to draw information from a variety of different sources, and sometimes we have to choose whether to use the technically correct scientific evidence or whether we have to ignore it, because sometimes it may actually be safer in our judgment to use different evidence or to make a different judgment. There can't be rules for everything in life, because if we try to set rules for everything, we are inevitably going to lose the richness of experience, the richness of how the world works. It's also possible for biased minds to have invented those rules, thereby making every decision we make based on them biased. We need to be able to choose evidence qualitatively, but in a way that's unbiased. We have to be able to self-correct our bias. Again, it's hard to do, and no one is going to be able to do it perfectly, but it's something to which we should strive if we want to be the most critical thinkers. It's never going to be perfect, but then no practice is perfect. So while we should always choose best practice, sometimes the easiest solution is not necessarily the correct one. Living life requires us to take those risks in judgment sometimes. It requires us to know when to follow the intellectual rules and sometimes when to ignore the intellectual rules, because we just know in advance that sometimes those are going to not lead us to the most appropriate outcome. But again, be a responsible person in making those decisions, because in the end you are responsible for your actions, nobody else is. So if you're out there and you're having problems of your own, be very careful and seek advice if you need it. But in conclusion, I'm certainly not anti-science, and I am a strong advocate for critically minded thinking that uses methodologies that eliminate as much as possible our bias, because I know just how biased and how corruptible the human mind can be. And every day I see examples of people making potentially dangerous decisions based on information that is biased by their minds. Everyone should know about bias. Everyone should know that they need to self-check their minds and ensure that they're not inadvertently making mistakes. So I'm certainly not anti-science, but to be intellectually honest, nothing that we invent can possibly change objective reality. It only attempts to understand and explain it. So to make judgments based only on just a fleeting feeling and to make judgments based only on rigid rules potentially could be equally as problematic. Life involves making fine judgments, and part of the satisfaction of the journey is learning those skills and exercising them. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, if you have any concerns at all about yourself or someone else, please seek professional advice. And if you have been inspired by anything that you hear on my program, or you have an idea about what you'd like to hear me discuss, you'd like to be a guest or a collaborator, please contact me. I love to hear from my audience. And until next time, take care.